To kick us off here, my name is Jesse Herrera. I am the COO of NextGear, which was recently acquired by CoreLogic. Um, and I've been with the company for about 4 years. Been working most of my career in and around claims and restoration software. And through that, I've worked with a number of private equity firms and worked on a lot of M&A in the technology space. But today we're going to be talking a little bit more about specifically restoration contractors and M&A in that world. We are joined by Jeff Moore, who is the president of ATI Restoration. Jeff has been in the business for a very long time. It's a family business, so he joined with his brothers and his father has been in and around mitigation, remediation, restoration for 25 plus years. He is responsible for all the M&A activity at ATI, so he is constantly on the lookout for the next brand that they may be purchasing and has a great perspective to share today. We're also joined by Gokul Padmanabhan. Gokul is the owner of Restoration Brokers of America. Gokul specializes in working with restoration contractor founders and owners who and guiding them through the sales process. He's been at this for 15 plus years, and he's successfully sold over 200 businesses, representing more than $500 million in brokered transactions. So please join me in welcoming both Gokul and Jeff to the panel.
Thanks for having us, Jesse.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse.
So the format for today, we will go through a handful of questions here to just tee up the topic for everyone. We will then conclude with some audience questions. So you may notice on the Zoom controls there's a Q&A comment button. You're welcome to enter questions in anytime along the way. We'll queue those up, and then when we get toward the end and we're ready for audience questions, we'll pull from that list of questions and ask Gokul and Jeff to address those. So why this topic? So actually, our customers have raised this topic to us when we were asking them about different topics that they thought would be of interest and timely. The topic of M&A kept coming up, and rightfully so. If you look back, you can go ahead and advance the slide here. If you look back over the last few years, there's been an unbelievable amount of M&A activity in our industry. Both from a financial sponsor standpoint, private equity firms investing in platforms like ServPro selling to Blackstone, or ServiceMaster being purchased by Rourke Capital, and a number of others, as well as very active strategic buyers, folks like ATI and others, who have been expanding their footprint through acquisition in various markets. So it's I think a topic that's top of mind for everyone, and for good reason. So our plan today is to just talk a little bit more about the why, when, and how restoration contractors should consider selling their business or seeking a growth equity partner. And without further ado, why don't we go ahead and launch in? Gokul, I'll direct this first question to you and then let Jeff comment as well. Why should an owner consider an exit?
Well, great question, Jesse. You know, I think there's a lot of technical issues why people should sell a business, but I'll give you my own example of that, right? I think when I sold my business, for almost 2 years before that, in my heart, in my gut, I knew that I wasn't a good shepherd for that business anymore, right? Whether it was burnout or was doing too much, or maybe lost interest, or maybe I wanted to do other things in my life when I sold some of my other companies. You know, I knew it for a long time. So I think that's, you know, one of the biggest reasons, you know, of when or why someone should sell their company. If you're doing a gut check and you're alone in the truck driving or in the car, and you know that you're not a good shepherd for your company anymore, or a good shepherd for your employees and giving them opportunities to grow, further their career, or even a good shepherd for your customers, you know, where you're absolutely pumped about taking care of them. I think when you're feeling like that, it's a signal that you should exit the business. At least that's what it was for me. I kept feeling that way for almost 2 years as I was preparing one of my companies to sell, and then I did. And I still talk to the person that acquired my business, and they're doing so much better now. They've almost doubled in size in a year. Team leads have become managers, and managers have become better positioned. So it was the right thing to do. So that's what I would advise folks that are listening today.
Jeff, additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely what Gokul said. I said, ultimately, we are, as a business owner, we look at our business just like our children. And at the end of the day, you always want to do what's best for your child or your business. And if that's more opportunities, whether it's for personal reasons, whether it's professional reasons, I think that's what you really want to look into. Are you able to continue to provide opportunities, whether it's to your customers, whether it's how competitive the market's getting, how much it's consolidating. It could be, for retirement reasons. At the end of the day, you always want to have a backup plan for everything, whether it's retirement, whether there's more competitors coming into the market and I can't compete. At the end of the day, I think we all want to do what's best for the business, which isn't always necessarily what's best for you personally. So I think it's a balancing act of, what do I want to do or continue to do, and what's best for the business, what's best for the customers, and most importantly, what's the best outcome for my employees. And if that's me partnering with someone else to allow us to get more jobs, be more competitive, drive gross profit margins up, ultimately, I think as an owner, that's what everyone is looking to do. So everyone's right time is different based off their perspective, their market, the age of the owner, and a lot of other variables.
So Jeff, once an owner has maybe come to the conclusion that they in fact are thinking about selling the business, the question about timing is what they probably have to consider next, and trying to decide. Just because you think you want to sell doesn't mean that now is necessarily the best time to do that, but it may be. So what are the factors or considerations from your perspective that has to be top of mind for an owner when they're trying to think about when to do it?
I think there's a couple factors you want to look into, Jesse. I think first and foremost, where's the market at? So I can tell you right now, it's a hot market. So it's no different than the stock market. Anyone who's invested in the stock market the last 2 years, has been incredible. I think it's been the same thing in our space. Where is the market going to be in 3 or 4 years? With taxes changing, with each administration, I don't think any of us have an idea, but I can tell you from a timing and evaluation perspective, now is a great time. And I think in the near future, I don't know if that's 1 or 2 years is a good time. So I think that's one factor. But ultimately the right time is, first of all, I think it comes down to you and the business and what kind of crossroads are you? Are you considering retiring? You certainly don't want to consider selling your business as you're ready to retire. You want to have that plan and have it in place. And I think ultimately the best time is when your business is in its healthiest spot. So I can tell you that the biggest mistake an owner makes is they receive a call, they get an offer. That's not necessarily the best time to sell your business. Ultimately, you should always consider all options, but ultimately the best time is when you've planned strategically. And so you need to get your books in order. You need to get your finances in check. You need to make sure you've got a lot of other things in your house built and built well before you go to market, because there's a lot of planning. And I think if you look at your business as always ready to sell the business, so that way, whenever the time comes, you need to operate your business like that. And there's a lot of intricacies that go to prepping a company for sale. You never have to sell a business. You can always take the phone calls. But the right time is when your house is in order. Have you had a good solid year? Have you had 2 years in a row? If you're coming off a bad year, this year may not be the best year to do it. If you got beat up during COVID, you're not going to get your maximum valuation now versus if you waited 12 months. But I think if you take that, the biggest thing is a mental hurdle. Once I'm open to the idea, you get your books in order, and at that point, you're the shepherd of your own ship, and you can decide when the right time is.
Very good. Gokul, thoughts on that from your perspective?
Yeah, so let me just add some thoughts to what Jeff just talked about, right? So I think, the best time to sell, at least in my experience, is when I was ready to sell, right? I mean, I knew like, okay, I'm the bottleneck for this business, right? But having said that, to kind of second what Jeff just said, the best outcomes that we see in our firm is when someone actually, when they're ready to sell, and then they take time to prepare their business to sell, and then they bring it on the market. Okay. And that runway could be about a year, sometimes even 2 years out. So that's what I would encourage, people who are listening today to really take into account. It's not as simple to get really good outcomes. It's not as simple as I want to sell and I'm going to take to market tomorrow and I'm going to find a buyer. Correct. I mean, almost 80% of the companies that call us, and entrepreneurs and restoration owners that call us, their company is not ready to sell. And we work with them for over a year, sometimes even 2 years, to get it to a point where folks like Jeff would be interested in purchasing it. So I always encourage people is not to wait, till the 11th hour and say, okay, I'm done. I want out yesterday. Get me out of here, Gokul. And, that's impossible to do. To really get good outcomes, I would encourage people to start thinking about it maybe a year to 2 years out.
Yeah, that's interesting, because both of you alluded to the same thing, which is preparing early and thinking about that and anticipating what's going to need to be done. So maybe you can elaborate on what you mean by that. So what does the sales process normally look like, and how do restoration contractors need to prepare for that? Because it sounds like, if it's taking up to 2 years to prepare for it, obviously there must be a lot of steps involved.
There's a lot of steps involved, right? So I call them my core four, and I made some notes here. So let's talk about financial performance and financial reporting, how you keep your books, how you keep your WIP reports, your monthly, all these accounting principles. A lot of companies have hybrid systems, and it takes years to unwind them and get it to a point where you can tell the story, and Jeff and his folks can understand it properly. That itself will take you 2 years to unwind it. Okay, so you got the financial side, you got the growth potential and the investment thesis. Why should someone buy your business? You got to develop your bench strength and your culture. That's really important. And then your quality of your earnings. You need a diversified revenue stream for someone like Jeff or whoever to buy your business to be even interested in it. So you kind of, if you look at those as dials, you have to be green in all of those 4 dials. And sometimes, and not all companies are that way. In our firm, almost 80% of companies have one of those dials that are absolutely red, and then it takes some time to make them green and then prepare them and then get them to the market, right? I know, Jeff, you may have some thoughts looking at companies all the time.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'd recommend if you're thinking about going to market, you got to know your numbers. I'm shocked at how many people, as you talk to, what percentage, little simple things, Jess, what percentage of your business is commercial versus residential, how much of your business is program work. Quite honestly, a lot of contractors, I'll be honest, ATI didn't keep track of some of this stuff until just a couple of years ago, but those are really key metrics that you need to have in your business prior to sell. Because honestly, when we ask some of these questions, people are going in and manually calculating them. I would say getting an audited financials, those are very helpful, whether you're working with a broker like Gokul or someone direct, having and knowing that the quality of earnings are intact versus someone whose books are, I'd say, shaky or loose. And I think the most important part besides the financial piece is really your team. If you're an owner that's looking at selling because you want to retire, whether it's like this, I want to retire next year or I want to retire in 5 years, ultimately as a buyer, what I'm most interested in is the business is going to stand on its own. So who is that management team? And I'll be honest, half the time it's, I want to retire, Jeff, in 12 months or 24 months. And, my first question is, okay, well, I'm certainly investing in you, but quite honestly, I'm investing in who's standing behind you, who's in those shoes. And honestly, half the time it's, well, I just promoted this person and he's been an estimator. And, as a buyer, that's not necessarily reaffirming versus, no, I've been fading myself out. XYZ has been running the business for the last 18 months. And look, Jeff and Gokul, the business is performing better as I've stepped down. And now all of a sudden, I'm not really concerned if the owner wants to retire within 90 days of partnering or in 5 years, because I know the business has already gone through that and is ready for the next chapter. But as a buyer, if you're not ready for the next chapter, all of a sudden I'm questioning whether this is the right deal.
Yeah, you just alluded to an interesting dynamic that I've also seen with founder-based businesses, which is, I think a lot of times the founders get so sucked into the day-to-day operations and are so integral, either in running the business smoothly or managing revenue and growing customer relationships and that sort of thing, that they almost find themselves in a position where they can't take a day off, and the whole business value is wrapped up around that founder's participation in the business. And maybe, both of you could comment on this. What does that signal to you as the buyer? If you're going to try to buy that business, what concerns do you have?
Jeff, you want to go first?
Sure. So for me, if there's key man risk and there's too much, double downing on the owner, honestly, valuations, going, first of all, I may not be interested at all. And for some reason, if I am, valuations, I mean, you just shot yourself in the foot. The end of I think in any business, whether you're the owner or a manager, you always have to be able to, the people working for you need to be able to take over your job. And if you're an owner and there's not someone in your company, if something were to happen, actually the Moore family did this exercise for 3 or 4 years. We said, if something happened to dad tomorrow, what's the plan? And if you as an owner can't answer that, you're not ready for sale, because if you are, you're going to be a bargain sale. You're going to sell for 50% less than what you would sell for if you had that plan. So you always got to be asking that question, whatever the position is, whatever your role is in the company, someone needs to be able to know what you do and do it successfully. And that is the key for a smooth transition.
Yeah, I think, if I can add to what Jeff said, we call it the hub and spoke, right? So if you're the hub of all activities in your business really has no value outside of you, correct? And so, like I said, in my earlier question, Jesse, when we say about a 2-year runway, like that, maybe if that dial of what I call bench strength and culture is red, you can take 2 years and come up with a plan and say, okay, I got some really great potential, employees, and let me slowly start giving them bigger responsibilities, and let me slowly start stepping back and put systems in place instead. So that would be a great example of how you could use a 2-year runway to prepare your business for sale. But if you're working 80 hours a week or 100 hours a week, your business really has no value to a potential buyer. Even if it's an individual buyer and a smaller business, which we classify inside of 5 million and under in valuations, nobody's going to pay you a lot of money to work 80 hours a week. You wouldn't do it, so you don't want to expect somebody else to do it. Yeah.
So there's another topic here that both of you alluded to, which I think is an interesting one, around the data and the metrics underlying the business. And it sounds like you've both kind of alluded to, in some cases where owners or founders are scrambling to pull that data together to tell the story. Can you talk more about, one, why is that data and those metrics so important to this process? And what have you seen really well-run businesses do to prepare for that? Like what are the steps that, or best practices that folks on the call should be doing if they're thinking about selling?
For me, Jesse, I think it's really just knowing the data points are important. If you're looking to, you need to be able to track your data, whatever, system that you may be using, financial or an ERP or operations product, you need to be able to report, why are you making improvements? Why are you down for the year? Are you losing business? And, as an example, are you doing program work? Is that up or down? Are you, how much of the business are you self-generating? Because honestly, all of those play into valuation versus how much of that is through TPA business. So making sure you understand why you're up or down, you need to be able to tell a story. And I'll be honest, most owners can't tell the story of, if you're up 12% this year, my question is why? Are you up on the top line in revenue? Was it driven by a job? Was it driven by one account? And you need to be able to really reach into those stories and paint that picture, because ultimately that's what's going to drive ultimate valuation for a business. A lot of people will say, well, gosh, Jeff, I'm up 15% this year. Now it's the best time to sell. Well, as you dig in through the books, they did one job, and that's not necessarily indicative of a higher valuation, because you landed the largest job that the company's ever had. And so being able to pull out what are one-time jobs, what are one-time events, because quite honestly, those don't necessarily add dollar for dollar like normal everyday reoccurring revenue. That's what as a buyer we're looking for. What is the base business that we're getting? Because that's what we can bank on. We can't bank on, the largest job you've ever had. We can't count on the largest rain event maybe you've had in the history of whatever market you're in. So all those abnormality we need to factor out. And so I think knowing those are really important, because at the end of the day, it is a story that you have to paint. And ultimately, I want to hear the story of where you're going. Where are you going and how are you going to get there? And if you've been growing by 10% a year, I want to know why. And quite honestly, if you can't answer that question, again, that goes back to that key risk. Have you been lucky? Have you been strategic? And I want to know how you're going to continue to do that, because ultimately as a buyer, that's what I'm investing in. I want to see the same success, and I want to know how you've gotten there.
Yeah, very good. Gokul, given your experience helping prepare sellers, like what have you seen work well?
Yeah, so now I have an alarm going on here, but I'll talk a little bit over. So I think what I want to understand is, Jesse, is people that are running their business and people that are listening to this seminar, they got to understand that running a business is completely different than preparing it and selling it for sale. There are different technologies, there's different strategies. When you're running a business, you could even run it out of a checkbook, for example, right? And you may be happy with it. But when you get that business in front of Jeff, you got to be able to answer all kinds of questions about it. So they're completely different strategies, Yep,
very good. So a little bit more on the process itself. Maybe you can, Gokul, why don't you kick off on how to think about the process, or managing a seller's expectations on what that process looks like. And maybe even you could distinguish for us a little bit of, what is an IOI and what is an LOI and what is a purchase agreement, and why are those different, and why is it important to know the differences between those?
Yeah, so if you approach a buyer, they're going to come and look at your business at a really high level. And then they'll give you a letter of intent, which is, it's not a contract, but it basically outlines the broad brushstrokes of what the deal is going to happen, so to speak. And at that point, you would go exclusive with them for 90 days or 60 days or so. And then once the LOI is signed, it's called a letter of intent. Then, the buyer is going to do a ton of due diligence on the business. They're going to look under the hood, and they're going to know that the business is as advertised, pretty much, and that process takes a good 60 days or so to do. As the process is happening, you would then have the counsel on both teams, preparing a purchase agreement, and that takes a good 4 to 6 weeks, if things are going smoothly. There's always contentious issues between those that the principals have to agree on and compromise on, and so you have kind of the purchase agreement being developed, you got the due diligence, kind of being conducted, and 60 days, 90 days out, both of those efforts will come to some kind of a conclusion. And then at that point, you would have a purchase agreement that is agreed upon by both parties. You would sign the purchase agreement and then close. So at a really high level, that's how it goes. It goes from LOI, letter of intent, to creating the purchase agreement, doing the due diligence.
Very good. Jeff, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think on the front end, you've got IOIs and LOIs. I think if you're going through a real formal process where you've got say a broker like Gokul or someone else, and they're going to go out to the market, there's times where you may have, 3 interested parties, you could have 12. And so from someone who's buying companies, a lot of times a broker will ask us for an IOI, and that is essentially they'll give us limited access to the owner. They'll give us the financial information, but we won't have a lot of back and forth with the owner. And so what they're trying to do is trying to vet out who's serious, who do we actually want to move forward with before spending, whether it's 4 meetings or 7 meetings with someone like an ATI. I want to make sure that the valuation, they like what they hear from the company, and they'll typically narrow down that larger pool of people. And I can tell you as an acquirer, we'll use the IOIs, knowing that, someone like us is ultimately a competitor. There are owners out there that are very, especially if we sole source it and we're talking to someone or have a relationship, not every owner wants to give you everything under the hood right away. And so sometimes we'll issue an IOI, and that's simply based off of what the owner has shared with us on a verbal conversation back and forth without providing us any financial backup. And so sometimes owners, I think the biggest hurdle for an owner is, is this really what I want to do? And so sometimes they're fishing for, what's my business worth? Do I like what I hear? And if so, we'll issue an IOI that just says, hey, we think your business is worth between X and Y. I haven't validated anything. You told me that you do X amount in revenue, you make Y at the end of the year, and based off of this and no other information, we think we'll pay between these 2 figures. And if you like that range, let's have further discussions. Why don't you provide me a bunch of financial documents, and then within a couple of weeks you can get issued an LOI. So it's really more of a phase 1. It doesn't apply to all deals. I would say maybe 15 to 20% of the deals you have an IOI.
And can you clarify at what point in the process can the seller feel confident in the value that's on the table and essentially be at a binding agreement?
I think binding agreement, you're past a purchase agreement. So from IOI, you go to LOI, and at that point you've got a set figure, but you're probably 2/3 of the way approximately of due diligence. And we've seen deals that close in 30 days and some that have taken over 100 days. So whatever that time frame is, that's making the acquisition, I would say towards the latter 70%, on the 30-yard line, if you want to use a football analogy. Yep. You have a pretty good understanding that everyone's comfortable. The numbers are what you said they were. There wasn't any abnormalities like I said earlier, where maybe you grew your business, but it was through one large job that maybe wasn't disclosed early on, minus something like that. Values for the most part should stay, as long as you're being truthful and honest with the buyer on the front end.
So as maybe last question here on the process itself, Gokul, what do you see as the most challenging part of the process for owners? You work with a lot of them. I'm curious where they struggle most.
It is a complicated process, even though I tried to explain it and Jeff tried to explain it in 2 minutes on a webinar. I mean, these things happen over 4 months, intense meetings and things of that. So it is a complicated process. There's no doubt about it. And, for most founders, it is the pinnacle of their career, probably, right? Building a company and trying to sell it and things of that sort. And so, listen, I when I preach to my clients, and I always tell them, I said, preparation is the key, right? I mean, you want to go through and make sure that all your ducks are in a row. So when you get in front of a buyer or different buyers, and when you take to market, you are really confident, 1, about your valuation, 2, about passing due diligence, 3, about what is really important to you in a contract and what is not important to you in a contract. Because, no matter, how motivated a buyer is to buy your business, as a seller, you're not going to get everything that you want in the negotiating, right? So really preparing and understanding and reflecting and talking to your family of what are the most important things that I want out of the sale is also critically important, I think. So again, it's preparation. It's about just having a strategy and knowing what the end result should be for you, and then going there, I think is really the way to do it. I think people that just kind of get on the fly and take businesses to market without really preparing for them, not just the business, but even on a personal level, I think you get in trouble.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
So Jeff, I think one of the big questions on every potential seller's mind is going to be, what is my business worth? And you talked a little bit about that process and whatnot of managing those expectations, but how are businesses generally valued in this space? Like how should a restoration contractor be thinking about what, one, how the business is going to be valued, and two, what is a reasonable range?
So the range goes all over the board, Jesse. So if you look at a really small, couple $1 million company, could be as low as a 2 or 3 times EBITDA, which is essentially what they make in a year minus adjustments. And if you look at large companies, they're going for double digits, but you're talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And so that's a huge spread to explain what a business is worth. But from my perspective, I think the number one driver is, what are you making at the bottom line at the end of the year? What's your EBITDA? 2, what's your growth? How are you a growing business? Are you a flat business? Because if I'm investing in the future and I know you've proven year over year that you're growing, that's worth more than someone who's doing the same amount of revenue. So I've got a future growth trajectory. Outside of that, I think it comes down to your mix of business. It comes down to your story. It comes down to the management team. Again, the guy that wants to retire in 2 years and promoted someone a few months ago and is running the business, he's not worth as much as someone who's maybe an owner who wants to stick around and is selling for different reasons, and no one on his team is leaving and is going to be around for 15 years. And I think when it comes down to the mix of business, what are you doing in TPA or program work? I think that's a driver in valuation, because ultimately as a buyer, which is no different than an owner, we all want larger jobs. We all want more commercial work, but the reality is that's the harder piece of the business to get. So how much of that business are you generating? Because the reality is anyone can go into a market and start a restoration business and generate TPA business, as long as you can perform and operate correctly. So you really want to make sure you've diversified who are you doing business with. So we'll see operators are doing 80% of their work with, say, one of the TPAs. So maybe it's contractor connection. Well, all of a sudden, all it takes is a couple bad jobs or one bad operator or that guy that's running your business to, all it takes is 4 or 5 bad jobs in a row. And all of a sudden, if you get kicked off a contractor connection, even if it's for 30 days, that business isn't worth anything. So you want to really look at, who are you doing business with? And you don't want a high concentration. I think, any buyer is looking for anyone that's investing or has too much concentration in one. Is it one adjuster? Is it one property manager? Is it one TPA? The more you're diversified, you want to be able to run your business. And the same thing I talked about earlier in terms of, if something were to happen to me, who's going to take over for me? It's the same thing with your client. You need to be able, if you can afford to lose your biggest client tomorrow, that's a great business that I want to invest in. If your largest client is 30% of your business, I'm really concerned with who owns that, how many people have spider webs into that relationship. And if it's just the owner, that's a lot of volatility, because all of a sudden it could be one person at one business, and that, quite honestly, your client could get terminated tomorrow and that business could be gone. So making sure, and that it goes back to the numbers, Jesse, where you have to know, where are you doing business? How are you doing business? Are you making great margins in various divisions versus not? And making sure you can paint that story. But that is really what's going to drive valuation, is that mix of business. And that's where knowing those metrics is really important.
Hey, Gokul, you had mentioned earlier that this is somewhat of a seller's market right now. Yeah. Can you talk more about what's behind that? Why do you think that's the case, and what's driving values?
Yeah, I mean, you put that chart up in the earlier of our presentation, right? In the beginning of our presentation, there's a lot of mergers going on and acquisitions going on in our industry. And I think, let's put ourselves in a buyer's shoes right now, correct? They're looking at 10, 15 companies before they pull the trigger on 1 or 2. Okay, so they're pulling the trigger on maybe 20% of the companies they're looking at, correct? So it is a frustrating process from a buyer's point of view, because most companies that they look at is not ready to sell, correct? Some of their dials are red, like I've been saying earlier, correct? So if you are one of those companies that are that all your dials are green and you're absolutely ready to sell your business and it's a sellable business, right now, because of the liquidity in the marketplace, low interest rates, huge consolidation going on in our industry, they're commanding really, really good prices, and it's not just the price of the business, it's also the terms in which you're selling your business, So I think it's really bodes really well for somebody who's prepared and has a solid business going to market.
Very good. And maybe just one more area there. What if you're an owner and you're trying to increase the value of your business, you want to get paid maximum price.
Yeah.
I mean, are there any things that they can focus on to drive that, aside from all the things you talked about in the 2-year preparation process to get there? Are there other things they should be thinking about if they want to create value?
I think, there's, in our industry, everybody's talking about multiples on how, the company on earnings. And I think, I have full-time valuation guys on staff that do nothing but valuing restoration companies all over the country. So we have a pretty good handle on it. And I think that is really oversimplifying what a business is worth. It's not just the multiple, you know what I mean? It is strategically saying, why would somebody want to buy your business, right? And it's making sure that your financial reporting is in order. That would be where I would start, and then the second place I would start is absolutely having bench strength. Mm-hmm. Correct? Those two. And then third place I would start is make sure that my revenues are not all coming from the same place. So that will be my top 3. There's about 7 strategies that we use with our clients when we look at a business and we actually walk them through it and we strategize and get them ready for sale. But if you're listening and you want a place to start, those would be my top 3 to start.
Very good.
Yeah.
Let's change gears a little bit and maybe talk about the various advisors and intermediaries that can come into play in this process, whether it be bankers, lawyers, accountants, brokers like Gokul. Jeff, what are your thoughts on how how a seller should be thinking about who to enlist for help in this process? Do they need all those people? Do they not need them all? Does it vary depending on the situation?
So, I'll talk about each of them. I think first and foremost, the lawyer is really key once you're ready to go down the process. Making sure you have them. You don't necessarily have to, hopefully you've got a relationship with them, but if you don't, as you're talking to someone and you're going to market, you need to know who your law firm is that's going to represent you in the deal. And so before you sign or once you receive an IOI or an LOI, to me, that's the process in which if you haven't already engaged them, you should. In terms of an accountant, I think that's someone that, that should, hopefully it's the accountant that's running your books. If you don't have, I know one of the biggest search for an owner is bringing unnecessary employees into the mix. So I think if you're an owner that doesn't want to bring a CFO or his controller or whoever's running the books internally, you need to bring in that outside consultant. So even if you've hired a broker like Gokul, you want to have someone that knows your books. So I don't care if it's internal or external, that will drive, whether you're bringing in an accountant. Besides that, you really don't need one, especially if you've got someone internal. As far as a broker like Gokul, I think for the right owner that doesn't have his finances in order, I think there's a lot of value. At the end of the day, they're going to know other restoration companies. I can tell you, we've done deals, I'd say 40 to 50% of them have brokers and then the other half don't. But a lot of those are relationship driven. And, if you know what you're looking to get and you know who you want to transact to, you may or may not need a broker. I think the broker is going to bring value when you don't have your financial diligence, when you don't want to bring in a lot of employees. I can tell you that's probably the biggest angst as an owner is I'm thinking about going through the process, but I don't know if I want to pull the trigger. I don't want to bring in my head of operations. I don't want my CFO to know. And quite honestly, that's when an outside accountant or someone like Gokul or a broker is going to bring a ton of value because you're going to be able to provide that intelligence behind the house without creating any disruption in the business. Because that is, in my opinion, that is the number one fear. That was, as ATI, as we worked with private equity, that was our biggest discussion is who do we bring in? Because initially we weren't sure if we'd go down this path. And honestly, our CFO wasn't involved to begin with. Eventually they were, but we didn't want any employees knowing. And I think that's the biggest fear of anyone is what happens if I tell them, and then what happens if I decide I don't want to do it last second, or what happens if the buyer backs out and all of a sudden all of my employees know. We've created so much angst in the business. And quite honestly, you could end up devaluing the business because people start walking out and all of a sudden my company is not worth as much. So there's a ton of value in having a broker to make sure you get a buyer at the end, because I think that's really important. And just like anything else, anyone wants more than one buyer. And I think that's what a broker is going to bring you.
Yeah, very good. So I've worked with a handful of founders when they're selling, and one of the things that I think surprises the ones who've never been through this process before is the level of detail of financial and operational information that need to tie back to financial records, and the minutia that a buyer is going to get into, to the point where, sometimes you feel founders, throwing up their arms saying, oh my God, why do you need to know that? Like, this is so detailed and everything needs to tick and tie. And it's overwhelming at times. And I think, I've seen founders struggle where maybe they didn't have a CFO or accountant or someone who really had their arms around the books in a way that they could answer those questions pretty quickly and painlessly. Gokul, I'm curious, is that something you can help folks overcome? Or if you're a founder and you're in that situation where you don't have that bench strength, at your fingertips, is that where folks like yourself can help, or is you're still going to need to make that investment as well?
No, we can help and that in many other ways, right? So I think just to add to the discussion here, I think from deciding to sell your company to actually closing the deal and having money change hands, so to speak, and it's a really complicated journey, whether it's a small company or a big company. And I think owners that have done it before, or founders that have done it before, maybe they don't need a full bench strength of team to help them, around that journey. Maybe they know the journey, they know what's around the corner, they know what to look for. But you've never been on that journey. I think it helps to surround yourself with professionals and a team that can take you there, right? Because there's, listen, I just got a due diligence list today. It had 178 questions on it. It doesn't surprise me because I live in it all day long, So I think it all just comes down to the journey and where the owner is at and where the founder. If the founder has done a couple of exits and they know what's around the corner, then they don't need a whole team. But if they've never been through that journey, I think the best outcomes we see is people that are doing it for the first time, really surrounding themselves with people that can take them there, to the market.
Yeah, very good. So I have one more question to maybe close on this session, and then we can convert over to the audience questions. So for those of you who have other questions, it looks like some have come in, but if you have more questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A now. And then we'll change gears. But if you're a potential seller, what would you be thinking in terms of what type of buyer and what are the pros and cons of different types of buyers? So, it could be, a private equity firm who's interested in getting into the space. If maybe you're a larger multi-location operator, or maybe it's a strategic, operator or buyer, someone like an ATI trying to expand their footprint. Or even, in some cases, family offices or other types of, financial sponsors. How do you think about each of those? Like, what are the pros and cons? And if you're a seller, how do you know which type of buyer is right for you? You want to kick us off there, Jeff?
Yeah. So I think it really comes down to what your plan is moving forward. So if you're in, it comes down to the reason why you're doing it. So I'll speak from a strategic. Why would you partner with a larger restoration company? I think the reasons why you would do that is you're looking for more opportunities for you, your employees. Maybe it's getting harder to compete. Maybe you want larger projects. Maybe your systems in the back of the house. Maybe you don't have the most robust system to run the business. Maybe you don't have the strongest financial person behind the house. Maybe you haven't made a huge investment in business development or marketing, or maybe you just don't know how to do it. Maybe it's more the unknown. And so the more that you're lacking in what I call back of the house, the strategic makes a lot of sense. They're going to bring the marketing, the business development, how to generate large loss, how to manage TPA business. They're going to round out what you already have and make subtle improvements, but they're not looking for the most part to change your business. It's going to continue to operate the way it is today. And the reality is, as an owner, your job will become easier because you're no longer going to be responsible for some of the day-to-day minutia, whether it's, you know, having the luxuries of a call center, to where right now, if you're the owner, guess what? Every customer wants to talk to the owner whenever there's a problem. And if you've got a full suite of people behind you, no difference in dealing with a complaint on a TPA job, or generating revenue online through SEO and online. You'll have a robust marketing department. So the pressure, and the way I explain it to an owner, Jesse, is allow us to do what you love. And at the end of the day, as an owner, we love working with our employees. We love generating revenue and providing our services to more clients. But the reality is 80% of an owner's time is dealing with everything else. It's hiring people. It's dealing with problems. It's procurement issues. So I think those are the reasons why. If you're looking to take workload off, that makes a lot of sense. If you're looking to expand and grow, and you think you've got that secret sauce and maybe others don't, I think a family office, I think a private equity group, are you looking to work harder than what you're doing today? I mean, do you have something different than the rest of the companies? Because quite honestly, if you're the platform, similar to what ATI is, you are the foundation of the future of the organization, which means you're going to have to get your house in order. You're going to have the best systems out there. You're going to have the best staff and people. And quite honestly, if you're looking to grow, that's a whole new mechanism. And if you haven't done that before, they're going to be counting on you. And so it's a whole different work-life balance. Quite honestly, you being the platform is going to be a heck of a lot more pressure. It could be more potential for you long-term if that's what you want to do. But someone who's looking to retire in the next 5 to 10 years, I wouldn't recommend it. I think joining a strategic makes more sense. But gosh, if you're 30, 40, even 50 years old, and you want to grow and expand, and you've done that at least to some extent, I think a family office or private equity makes a ton of sense. But it really comes down to you and how strong is your financial acumen and all the resources you have, because it's just more pressure on you.
Anything else you want to add to that, Gokul?
Yeah, sure thing, Jesse. So you know, I think people that are listening, you know, when we in our firm, when we bring clients to market, we take all of buyers and we put them in 2 different buckets. I'm going to oversimplify this, but you know, you got the strategic buyers and then you got the financial buyers, right? And the financial buyers are buying it purely for return on investment. You know, they're agnostic beyond that, and maybe that makes sense to you if that's what you want to do. And then you got the strategic buyers who are buying your business more than just the numbers. Maybe they need to be in your city. Maybe you got a ton of commercial work and they have a lot of residential, and together it makes a lot of sense to put the companies together. Or maybe you do a lot of TPA work and they don't. Whatever those synergies are, right? So I think strategic buyers actually make better fit and get, as a seller, bring you better valuations. You know, and sometimes though, you know, financial buyers may make sense. Just like Jeff said, if you want a second bite of the apple, or you want to be rolled up and you want to be the platform company and you want to work for another 10, 15 years with you know, better funds and better support and try to grow something even bigger. So at a really high level, you know, you start thinking about strategic and financial buyers and which makes more sense to you.
I think to summarize that, Jesse, you know, your financial buyer is just going to give you cash. You're gonna report out to them once a month. They're not going to be able to help you generate more business from carriers. They're not going to know what contractor connection is other than a very high level, and they're going to question you on a lot of things. They're not going to bring ultimate value besides a financial acumen and diligence, where the strategic is really going to be able to make improvements if there's improvements to be made, and really help scale the business and provide more opportunities. Because the reality is, whatever strategic it is, they're in your business. They understand the process of going even through due diligence is going to be so much simpler because they understand your business and they can relate versus someone outside. Again, it's just money. And if you had money, you know, what would you go do with it? So it's very different strategies.
Yeah. Very, very good point. Thank you. Let's change gears and try and hit some of these audience questions. There's a really interesting one here that surfaced around the notion that you both already talked about how important it is to have bench strength and succession plans in the business in terms of employees and so on. But as you know, in some cases, the buyers may not have a good ability to talk to those employees directly and assess that for themselves. So what are the strategies you see work there where both sides are a little reticent, right? I can see where sellers don't necessarily want buyers coming in there banging around talking to people until really absolute necessary, maybe never. But at the same time, the buyer's trying to get comfortable that they've got the right team and they've got people that they can lean on in terms of leadership.
So from my perspective, I can tell you, we traditionally, I would certainly recommend anyone that you're comfortable looping them in the process as early as possible, because the process is the most overwhelming thing you'll ever do in your life. And so if you're doing it all by yourself, it's work 2.0, because you're going to work twice as hard over the next 2 to 4 months than you've ever worked. And so doing it in solo, forget weekends, nights, everything else, because you have to run your business and run the due diligence. So if you're not comfortable bringing in people, which is very common, we typically don't require, I want to know high level about the people. How long have they been with you? Give me the background. I don't need to speak to your general manager that's running your operation. What HCI will require typically 2 to 3 weeks from closing. So basically we're at that, I think we're past the 30-yard line. We're probably at the 15-yard line. And honestly, it's really it's a gut check. So we just want to make sure that there's nothing funny going on in the business. The owner is a good, reputable person. The employees like working there. And that's typically the last step for us, because the last thing we want to do is interrupt your business and we typically require 5 employees, but it depends on the size of the business. But typically by the time we've done that, we've already essentially passed all the other hurdles. And for us, it is literally the last hurdle. And we just want to make sure there's nothing that the books aren't telling us about the character of the owner and the business. And it's really just that last gut check. Is there anything that we need to know, or maybe we don't want to acquire this business for whatever reason, and really just to get to know them as employees to make sure they want to stay on board. But from the front end, I can tell you, having been through the process and looked at other deals, the more you can bring in early on, even if it's 1 or 2 people, you will not regret it down the road. You're going to have a ton of anxiety about it, because everyone's biggest fear is this isn't going to transact, and now other people know about it. Have them sign an NDA, give them some small financial incentive to be part of the team. And honestly, I've seen it be well received from our part and from businesses that we've talked to, because they now feel like they're part of that inner circle and they're trusted. But it needs to be a very select few employees, but it is not a requirement on our end whatsoever.
Very good. Thank you. Hey, Gokul, we got a question here about a franchise operator, so an individual franchisee wanting to sell the business, and wondering whether or not in this market that is a more or less attractive. So, of any of the things we've talked about, is there anything you would change about the discussion if you're a franchisee trying to exit, or is it all more or less the same? And is this a good time?
Yeah, so we do a lot of franchises in our firm as well. Franchises, we're preferred resellers for a lot of the big ones all over the country. And I looked at the data just a couple of weeks ago. Our franchise multiples have gone up about 12 basis points from about a year ago. So it is still a seller's market for franchisees as well. The only added element there is, when we get a buyer, is you want to find a buyer that the franchisor would approve, and they would approve as part of the deal. So that is kind of like a little added element there. But beyond that, I think the fundamentals of how you prepare and sell are pretty identical.
Very good. And then Jeff, we've got a question here about how COVID has affected valuations over the past 18 months or so. What impact has COVID had on some of the restoration businesses, and how they should be thinking about value, either favorably or unfavorably?
I think it really comes down to the business. I'd say half the businesses we've talked to excelled in COVID, and half of them got hurt. So I think it comes down to the numbers and painting the picture. I can tell you in general, claims average size have gone down. So if you're able to paint the picture to ATI as an example, that yes, I did, say 500 jobs last year. in 2020 and in 2019, I did the same number of jobs, and the job size just shrunk due to COVID, because the reality is everyone was home. So the severity of claims were down. Insurance carriers were paying less dollars on every job. That's a great story to paint. And if you're showing me a run rate moving forward, it may not hurt you at all. But if you don't have the data and you can't tell the story, because a lot of times people will tell me, well, I did 20% less jobs. Well, the reality is there wasn't 20% less claims. The severity's down, but quite honestly, claim volume was up during COVID. It wasn't down, but the severity was. So again, it's all getting into those metrics and painting that story, and how you do it is really important. So we've totally washed out COVID, knowing that the future is brighter and taking that into consideration, and haven't devalued the business. But then there's others, given the metrics and their data, that honestly, at the end of the day, if you're worth less last year because your EBIT is down and you can't paint that great story, then quite honestly, your business is worth less. And if that's the case, you probably want to wait another year or two before you consider going to market.
Very good. Thank you all. So we're almost at the end of time. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here rather than try to fit in anything else in the last minute or so. First and foremost, thank you, Gokul. Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate you both taking time out of your extremely busy schedules to share your insights here. I think it's been very valuable and helpful. Thanks to all the audience for joining us today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to participate. Hope you all found this valuable and insightful. As you're leaving the session, you will get prompted for a survey. We really value the feedback. It helps us make sure we're delivering good content and hitting the mark for all of you. So if you can spare 2 minutes as you exit, would appreciate you taking a moment to complete that survey. With that, thank you all. I hope you have a great week and appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone.